The letter in Stone McCrae's hand felt as fragile as a dried leaf. Penned in a delicate, looping script, it spoke of a gentle woman named Nora Hart from Boston, a woman seeking refuge from the city's stifling expectations, a woman of quiet disposition who wished for a simple life and a kind husband. It was a letter of hope, a whisper from a distant world. Stone, a man carved from the harsh granite of the Montana Territory and haunted by the ghosts of Antietam, had read it until the paper grew soft and the ink blurred. He'd agreed to her passage, sending the fare with a note of his own, as sparse and direct as the landscape he called home. He expected a sparrow, someone small he might need to shelter from the relentless wind. He did not expect the woman who stepped down from the stagecoach. She was tall for a woman, with a straightness to her spine that suggested not fragility, but resilience. Her traveling dress, though worn, was of good quality, and she moved with a grace that was economical and purposeful, not decorative. Her gaze swept over the muddy street of redemption, taking in the saloon, the general store, and finally, him. There was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, unnerving assessment. He stood by his wagon, a hulking figure in buckskin, his face a roadmap of hard miles and harder memories. He had not offered his name. "You are Stone McCrae," she said. It was not a question. Her voice was lower than he'd imagined, clear and steady, without the fluttery uncertainty he'd anticipated. He gave a curt nod, his mind reeling. The contradiction between the woman in the letter and the woman before him was a chasm. "Mom." She extended a gloved hand, not for him to kiss, but to shake. Her grip was firm. "I am Nora Hart." The journey back to his homestead was a silent, tense affair. The wagon wheels groaned through the mud-slicked ruts of early spring, and the air, frigid and smelling of pine and melting snow, filled the space between them. Stone's thoughts were a tangled mess. He felt deceived, though he couldn't articulate how. The woman beside him sat unflinching against the jolts of the wagon, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the jagged peaks of the mountains that clawed at the sky. She seemed to belong to this landscape far more than the woman of the letter ever could. He had built his cabin in the shadow of those peaks to be alone, to keep the world and its complexities at a distance. Now, a profound and formidable complexity sat beside him. When they finally reached the small, sturdy cabin nestled in a high meadow, he pulled the wagon to a halt and turned to her, his jaw tight. "The letter," he began, his voice rough. "It wasn't yours." Nora's gaze met his without wavering. "A friend wrote it on my behalf," she embellished. She believed it was what a man like you would want to hear. "And what is it you want, Mrs. Hart?" he asked, the formal address a deliberate barrier. "The same thing you do, Mr. McCrae," she replied, her voice cool and pragmatic. "A place to make a stand. A chance to be left alone." A gust of wind whipped a strand of dark hair across her face, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something beyond composure. A deep, settled weariness that resonated with the exhaustion in his own bones. He had sought a wife to fill the silence of his cabin, to perform the duties that would allow him to work his claim. He now suspected he had found something else entirely. An equal, a mystery, and perhaps a complication he was not prepared for. The wilderness around them was an honest danger, a threat you could see and fight. The danger this woman represented was quieter, deeper, and it had already breached the walls he'd spent years building around his heart. They established their terms that first night, not as husband and wife, but as partners in a precarious venture. The small cabin, with its single room and sleeping loft, suddenly felt charged with an unspoken tension. Stone laid out the reality of their situation with blunt pragmatism. The winters were brutal, the work relentless. Raiders, both native and white, were a constant threat, and the land itself was an unforgiving adversary. He spoke of survival, not comfort. Nora listened, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. When he finished, she simply nodded. "I will earn my keep, Mr. McCrae. I am not afraid of work." He expected her to claim the loft, the more private space. Instead, she laid her bedroll near the hearth. "You know this cabin better than I," she stated simply. You should have the advantage of position, should trouble come. The observation startled him. It was a tactical thought, the kind a soldier would have. The next morning, he awoke before dawn to the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood. Peering out the window, he saw her, sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, muscled forearms, cleaving logs with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. She wasn't just capable. She was proficient. Later that day, while he was mending a harness, he watched her from the corner of his eye. She moved about the cabin with an innate sense of order, cleaning his Spencer rifle with a practiced hand, checking the seals on their winter provisions, her movements deft and sure. There was nothing of the Boston lady about her. A week passed in this state of cautious observation. They spoke little, their communication functional, revolving around the tasks required to fortify the homestead before the last of the snows melted. The south fence needs mending. We're low on salted pork. I'll take the first watch tonight. Yet, in their shared silence, a grudging respect began to form. He saw the calluses on her hands and knew they weren't from her journey west. He saw the way she scanned the tree line, her eyes constantly moving, and recognized the vigilance of someone who had learned not to trust her surroundings. One evening, a sudden blizzard descended from the mountains, trapping them inside. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes. To break the oppressive silence, Stone found himself speaking, the words coming out rough and unused. He told her about the war, not the grand battles, but the quiet, terrible moments in between. The smell of the field hospital, the weight of a dying comrade in his arms. He spoke of why he'd come to Montana, to a place so vast and empty he hoped it might swallow the noise in his head. Nora listened without interruption, her gaze steady on the fire. When he was done, the cabin was silent save for the storm. In Boston, she began, her voice low, there is a different kind of war. It is fought in whispers, in drawing rooms and behind closed doors. Its weapons are judgment and shame. She told him of her first husband, Edmund Vale, a wealthy merchant who was as cruel in private as he was pious in public. She spoke of the doctors, the invasive examinations, the final, humiliating pronouncement. Barren. In that world, a woman's worth was measured by her ability to produce an heir. Hers was deemed zero. After Edmund's death from a sudden fever, his family had cast her out, leaving her with nothing but the scandal that clung to her name. The world told me I could never bear a child, she said, her voice devoid of self-pity, a simple statement of fact. My friend believed a new life in the West was my only hope. She wrote that letter, creating a woman she thought would be acceptable. A woman who was not me. Stone looked at this strong, resilient woman and saw the truth. She hadn't come west for a husband. She had come for an escape. She was a refugee just as he was. The deception of the letter no longer mattered. It was a key that had unlocked her cage, and his. That night, the space between their bedrolls felt smaller, not because of proximity, but because it was now filled with a shared understanding. They were two broken people who had sought solitude, only to find a strange and unexpected solace in the presence of another. The trial period was over. Their partnership, forged in practicality and sealed by confession, had truly begun. The first sign of the greater threat arrived on a bright spring morning, the kind that held the false promise of peace. Two men on horseback rode into the meadow, their confident postures a stark contrast to the caution of most travelers. The man in the lead was broad-shouldered, with a predatory smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. He introduced himself as Jack Reynolds. Fine piece of land you've got here, McCrae, Reynolds said, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, the newly mended fence, and lingering for a moment too long on Nora, who stood on the porch, the Spencer rifle held loosely but ready at her side. It suits me, Stone replied, his hand resting near the Colt Peacemaker on his hip. He'd seen men like Reynolds before, men who took what they wanted, cloaking their greed in a thin veneer of civility. The Northern Pacific Railroad seems to think so too, Reynolds said, his smile widening. They're pushing a new spur line through this valley. My associates and I are acquiring the necessary properties. We're prepared to make you a fair offer. "It's not for sale," Stone said flatly. This land was more than dirt and trees to him. It was his sanctuary, the one place the ghosts of his past grew quiet. Reynolds's eyes hardened. "Everything's for sale, McCrae. It's just a matter of finding the right price. Some prices are paid in cash. Others are paid in blood. Think on it." He tipped his hat with mocking politeness toward Nora and wheeled his horse around, his companion following suit. They rode off, leaving a palpable sense of menace hanging in the clean mountain air. That evening, Stone and Nora sat at the rough-hewn table, a map of the valley spread between them. "He's not just an agent," Stone mused, tracing the river with a calloused finger. "He's a vulture. The railroad gives him a pretext, but his aim is control. He saw me as a vulnerability," Nora added, her voice tight with anger. "A weakness he could exploit to get to you." "He was mistaken," Stone said, meeting her gaze. The respect in his eyes was absolute. "We need to know what we're up against." The next day, Stone rode into Redemption. He sought out Tom Pike, the gruff but honest owner of the general store. Over a shared cup of bitter coffee, Tom confirmed Stone's fears. Reynolds and his gang had been terrorizing homesteaders up and down the valley for months, using the railroad's name as a shield. They'd buy out the fearful and burn out the stubborn. Marshal Jenkins, the town's only law, was a good man but outmanned and intimidated. "He's got a dozen hired guns at his beck and call," Tom warned, his voice low. "They're squatting at the old Miller place, using it as a base. You and the missus need to be careful, Stone." Reynolds doesn't take no for an answer. When Stone returned to the homestead, he found Nora not in the cabin, but on a small rise overlooking the meadow, practicing with the Spencer. She fired in a steady rhythm, not wasting shots, each one hitting the tin can she'd set on a distant stump. She reloaded with a fluid, practiced motion that spoke of countless hours of training. "My father believed a woman's education was incomplete without knowing how to defend herself," she explained, seeing his unasked question. "He said the most dangerous predators often wear the finest suits." The memory of Edmund Vale, the man in the fine suit, hung between them. Stone understood then that Nora had been fighting men like Reynolds her entire life. They began to fortify the homestead in earnest. They dug a shallow trench along the front of the cabin, reinforced the door, and boarded up the back window, leaving only small slits for firing. They mapped out fields of fire, established fallback positions, and planned for a siege. Their conversations became tactical, their movements synchronized. They were no longer two individuals sharing a space. They were a single, determined unit. The nights grew tense. They took turns on watch, the silence of the wilderness no longer peaceful but filled with imagined threats. During one late-night watch, sitting by the low-burning fire, Nora looked at Stone, her expression serious. "In Boston, I was told my life was a dead end, that I could build nothing, leave nothing behind. Fighting for this place, it feels like the first real thing I've ever built." Stone felt a profound shift inside him. He had come here to forget a life of fighting, to let his past die. But in preparing to defend this home with Nora, he felt a new sense of purpose taking root. It wasn't about death and survival anymore. It was about protecting a future. "We'll hold it," he said, the words a solemn vow. Together, the quiet affection that had been growing between them, as tentative as a spring wildflower, was now being forged into something stronger in the heat of shared danger. They were preparing for a war, but for the first time, Stone felt like he was fighting for a reason he truly believed in. The attacks began with insidious subtlety. A section of their fence was cut during the night, allowing their 2 mules to wander off. It took them half a day to track the animals down in the foothills. A week later, they found their small vegetable garden trampled, the tender shoots crushed into the mud. These were not random acts. They were messages from Reynolds, designed to wear them down, to remind them of their isolation and vulnerability. But instead of breaking their spirit, the provocations only hardened their resolve. Each act of sabotage was met with quiet, determined repair. They worked side by side, their shared purpose a silent language between them. The psychological warfare escalated. One afternoon, while Nora was fetching water from the creek, one of Reynolds's men, a lanky youth with cruel eyes, appeared from the trees. He didn't draw a weapon, but his presence was a clear threat. He spoke to her in a low, suggestive tone. His words meant to unnerve and intimidate. Nora didn't flinch. She simply raised the shotgun she now carried everywhere and leveled it at his chest. "The next word you speak will be your last," she said, her voice as cold and hard as river stone. The man's smirk vanished. He backed away slowly, his bravado evaporating in the face of her unwavering calm. When Stone heard what had happened, a cold fury settled deep in his gut. It was one thing to threaten his land. It was another to threaten her. That night, under the cover of darkness, he became the ghost he once was on the battlefields of the South. He moved through the woods with silent purpose, circling the old Miller place where Reynolds's gang was holed up. He didn't engage. He observed. He counted the men, noted their routines, the placement of the guards, the layout of the buildings. He was gathering intelligence, preparing the battlefield. He returned to the cabin just before dawn, the scent of the forest clinging to him. Nora was awake, a fresh pot of coffee brewing on the stove. She looked at him, and he knew she understood where he had been. He laid out his findings on the table, using twigs and stones to represent the enemy's positions. "There are 12 of them, including Reynolds," he said. "They're overconfident, lack security. They believe they've already won. Their arrogance is a weapon we can use against them," Nora replied, her mind as sharp and strategic as his. They spent the next few days in intense preparation. They created diversions, setting up tripwires connected to tin cans on the far side of the meadow. They positioned their limited supplies of ammunition at key firing points within the cabin. They planned for every contingency they could imagine. A fire, a direct assault, a prolonged siege. During these tense days, the last of the walls between them crumbled. The shared danger stripped away all pretense, leaving only a raw, profound connection. One evening, as they cleaned their weapons by the fire, Nora's hand brushed his. The simple touch sent a jolt through him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a partner or a survivor, but the woman she was, intelligent, courageous, and beautiful in her strength. "Stone," she said softly, her voice losing its usual guarded tone. "Whatever happens, I am glad I answered that letter." "It was the wrong letter," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "But it brought the right woman." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. It was a gesture of immense tenderness from a man who had forgotten how to be gentle. In that moment, surrounded by the looming threat of violence, they found a quiet, desperate peace in each other. Their bond, born of necessity, had deepened into a love as rugged and resilient as the mountains that watched over them. They knew Reynolds would not wait much longer. The final confrontation was coming, and they would face it together, not as two isolated souls, but as a fortress of two. The attack came at dusk, the time of day when shadows lengthen and merge, and the world holds its breath between light and dark. A single rifle shot cracked through the evening quiet, shattering the peace and kicking up a spray of dirt just feet from the cabin door. It was the signal. Stone and Nora were already in position, the cabin dark, the firing slits their only connection to the unfolding violence. "They're testing us?" Stone murmured, his eye pressed to the spyglass he'd salvaged from his army days. "Trying to draw our fire, make us reveal our numbers." "Let them wonder," Nora replied from her position at the side window, the stock of the Spencer rifle cool and solid against her shoulder. The initial assault was clumsy and arrogant. 3 of Reynolds's men charged across the open meadow, whooping and firing wildly, expecting to overwhelm the lone homesteader they believed was inside. Stone waited, his breathing slow and even, the world narrowing to the space between his front sight and his target. He let them get closer, let their confidence swell. Then he fired. One shot. The lead rider cried out and tumbled from his saddle. The other 2 faltered, their charge breaking as they scrambled for cover. From the cabin, Nora fired a single, carefully aimed shot that ricocheted off a boulder near the second man, sending stone splinters flying. It wasn't meant to kill, but to terrify, to sow chaos. The message was clear. This was not one frightened farmer. This was an organized defense. Enraged, Reynolds ordered a full assault. Gunfire erupted from the tree line, bullets thudding into the log walls of the cabin. Stone and Nora moved with grim efficiency, a well-oiled machine of defense. They fired sparingly, making every shot count, changing positions after each volley to create the illusion of more defenders. The tripwires Stone had set on the flanks of the meadow were triggered, the clatter of tin cans in the darkness causing a brief, panicked volley of fire from Reynolds's men at phantom enemies. For an hour they held them at bay. But Reynolds was relentless. He sent 2 men to circle around the back, hoping to set the cabin ablaze. Stone had anticipated this. He had positioned a bucket of water near the rear wall. As the orange glow of a torch appeared at the back window, Nora was already there, dousing the flames before they could take hold. Stone provided covering fire from the front, forcing the would-be arsonists back into the woods. The fight settled into a tense siege. Reynolds knew he couldn't take the cabin by direct assault without unacceptable losses. He would wait them out. But Stone and Nora had another plan. They had a secret weapon, their knowledge of the land. The creek bed, Stone whispered to Nora in the darkness. It runs 20 yards from the back of the cabin and provides cover all the way to the ridge. A retreat? Nora asked, her voice tight. No, Stone corrected. A flanking maneuver. It was a desperate gamble. One of them would have to leave the relative safety of the cabin to circle around and attack Reynolds's men from the rear. I'll go, Stone said immediately. No, Nora countered, her voice firm. You are the better marksman from a fixed position. I am faster and quieter. They will not be expecting a woman to come out of the dark. I will draw their fire, and you will finish them. He looked at her, seeing the fierce determination in her eyes. There was no time to argue. He trusted her judgment as much as his own. With a final, shared look that conveyed everything they couldn't say, Nora slipped out the back door and vanished into the night. The minutes that followed were the longest of Stone's life. He kept up a steady, sporadic fire from the cabin, moving between the windows to make it seem like he was still there in force. He listened, his senses strained, for any sound of her. Then he heard it, a single, sharp crack of the Spencer rifle from the ridge, far to the left of where Reynolds would expect an attack. It was followed by a cry of surprise and pain. Nora's shot threw Reynolds's men into confusion. They returned fire toward the ridge, their attention completely diverted. It was the opening Stone needed. He burst from the cabin, his colt barking in the darkness, moving swiftly toward their exposed flank. The battle was no longer a siege. It was a chaotic, close-quarters firefight. Caught in a crossfire between Stone's relentless advance and Nora's deadly accurate shots from the high ground, Reynolds's gang broke. Those who could, fled into the night. In the sudden, ringing silence, Stone saw Reynolds, a dark shape near the tree line, raising his pistol to take aim at Nora's position on the ridge. Stone fired without thinking, his last bullet hitting Reynolds square in the chest. The man crumpled to the ground, the last echo of the gunshot fading into the vast Montana quiet. The siege was over. Stone stood amidst the acrid smell of gunpowder, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning the ridge. He saw a figure rise from the rocks, and a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over him. Nora was safe. They had held their home. In the gray light of dawn, the aftermath of the battle was stark and brutal. They moved through the quiet meadow, their exhaustion a heavy cloak. Marshal Jenkins and a small posse from Redemption arrived, drawn by the sound of the sustained gunfire. They found Stone and Nora, not as victims, but as victors, standing amidst the evidence of their fierce defense. The marshal, a man who had been cowed by Reynolds, looked at the two of them, at the grim determination in Stone's face and the unwavering strength in Nora's, and saw not just homesteaders, but the seeds of a law that came not from a badge, but from the will to protect what was right. He and his men helped bury the dead, their silence a testament to a newfound respect. The days that followed were filled with the quiet work of rebuilding. They repaired the bullet-scarred walls of the cabin, mended the fences, and cleared the debris from the meadow. The physical labor was a balm, a way to process the violence and reclaim their home. The threat was gone, but the experience had irrevocably changed them and the space they inhabited. The cabin was no longer just his shelter or her refuge. It was their sanctuary, consecrated by their shared struggle. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of purple and gold, the silence between them was no longer one of cautious observation, but of deep, comfortable peace. "The trial period is over, I reckon," Stone said, his voice a low rumble. Nora turned to him, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time. "And what is the verdict, Mr. McCrae?" He took her hand, his large, rough palm enveloping hers. "The verdict is that I was a fool for ever thinking I wanted to be left alone. What I wanted was to not be haunted. You, Nora Hart, you are the quietest I've ever been." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple gesture of trust and belonging that spoke volumes. "And you, Stone McCrae, have given me a home in a world that told me I had no place." Their purpose, they soon realized, extended beyond their own fence line. News of their stand against Reynolds traveled through the valley. They became a symbol of defiance. A few weeks later, a young homesteader named William Turner rode up to their cabin, his face etched with worry. Another land agent, representing a different company but using the same tactics, was trying to force his family from their claim. Without hesitation, Stone and Nora agreed to help. They didn't ride in with guns blazing. Instead, they stood with the Turner family, their presence a silent, formidable statement. They advised them, taught them how to fortify their home, and organized other homesteaders into a united front. The agent, faced with a community instead of an isolated target, backed down. They had found their new legacy. They were not just survivors. They were protectors. They were building a community, a family bound not by blood, but by shared conviction and mutual defense. The promise of a child, once a source of shame for Nora and an irrelevance for Stone, was redefined. Their legacy would be the safety and prosperity of the families they helped protect, the piece of the world they were carving out and making just. One spring morning, a year to the day after her arrival, Nora stood on the porch, looking out at the greening meadow. Stone came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. They were partners in every sense of the word, their lives intertwined with a strength that surpassed any conventional vow. The world had told her she could never create a life, yet here, in this wild, beautiful place, she had built one more real and meaningful than she had ever imagined. The imposing, battle-scarred frontiersman who had once sought only solitude now found his ultimate peace in her presence. She, the woman shamed by a sterile high society, had discovered that true fertility lies in the courage to cultivate a life of purpose and love. Together, they were a testament to the fact that the families we choose are often stronger than the ones we are born into, and that a future is not something you are given, but something you build, bullet by bullet, day by day. She leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back, and knew she was finally, truly home. She made him feel as secure as he made her, a partnership of equals against a hard but beautiful world. Have you ever felt like the world handed you a script you never wanted to write? Nora and Stone tore theirs up and wrote a new one. Their story reminds us that strength isn't about fitting in, but about fighting for where you belong. If their journey from solitude to solidarity moved you, share this story with someone who understands that the best futures are the ones we build ourselves.